My guest at this time is Jarrett Stepman. He's a columnist for the Daily Signal, which is the media outlet affiliated with the Heritage Foundation. Jarrett is also the author of the brand new book, The War on History, The Conspiracy to Rewrite America's Past. And in the first part of our conversation, which you can also find on this site, we were talking about how many figures once revered in American history are now considered villains by certain parts of our society, because whether it was part of their personal lives or things they did conflicted and were contradictory with the ideas they espoused, that somehow that means their ideas of limited government and individual liberty can be cast aside as well. And towards the end of the first part of our conversation, Jarrett was talking about the importance of understanding people in the context of the times they lived and not judging them based on the way most people seem to think about things today. So my next question, as we picked up the conversation, had to do with that issue of context. In other words, how important is it to understanding where their ideas came from, how it explains their sometimes contradictory action, and what it can and can't excuse. And I specifically brought up the issue of Robert E. Lee fighting for Southern states and their push to preserve the institution of slavery, even though he personally had great misgivings about the institution of slavery.
Yeah, and I think you have to understand the context of pure humanity, too. I mean, these decisions all seem very obvious to us. I mean, the right side of history seems very obvious when looking back. In the moment, it may not be so obvious. Like, in the case of Robert E. Lee, does he choose to stick with the Union and conquer what at the time he thought was his country, the state of Virginia? For something that may be gone in a few years, he thought the Union might be gone, or do you join with the Confederacy? These decisions that a lot of these people made were sometimes very complex. We often don't have to make them because they've already been made for us a very long time ago. And I think it is absolutely fair to look back on the decisions they made to say, did they make the right ones? I mean, is that, what we consider justice? And I don't think you have to look back on Jefferson or Andrew Jackson or Lincoln and Lee and all these people and think, well, they made all the right decisions and that's why they're great. I don't think I think that's a very unwise way to look at history. Instead, look at, say, well, these individuals who were flawed, who maybe have ideas that we today would utterly reject and say, no, that's completely wrong. And anybody who holds that today would be deeply wrong and I would condemn it. Yet at the same time, some of the actions and decisions they made contributed to us today of having things so good, of having a better country, of having a more unified country. And I think that's a much healthier way to look at the past, which is very complicated. Is sometimes, not every hero is perfectly heroic and not every villain is perfectly villainous. And I think that is a healthier way to look at the past. And if we do simply put the standards of our own day in this kind of ideological spectrum, it really makes us draw short in how we understand the past and how we understand our own times, where the complicated moral decisions we may make on a daily basis, they're not always clear. And for many of the people in the past, they had to grapple with that, and we will too. And I think that's an incredibly important lesson to learn from history.
Jumping off on the Robert E. Lee point, because you also talk in that chapter about the effort to destroy the Union, we go back to August 2017, and obviously many folks in this country were horrified by what they saw in Charlottesville, Virginia, and ultimately that all, tangentially at least, was centered around whether or not to keep a statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, Virginia. And as you point out in the book, that led to basically a crusade to remove anything Confederate in terms of a monument or even a plaque in different parts of the country. But you also say within months it came absolutely in a 360-degree circle to the point where people were trying to take down remembrances of Abraham Lincoln. How did this happen?
Yeah, and it's really something. And what makes me upset is that a few white supremacists or these people who showed up at that statue kind of damaged this debate. And I kind of see it as two sides of the same coin: the people who want to destroy these monuments because of identity politics, and some odious people who really don't care about the history and the ideas of this country. They embrace identity. So I think both of those groups are a problem here. But it was very obvious to me, especially when talking about these kind of Confederate monuments, that the movement to get rid of them was not just simply based on, well, this guy was good for these reasons or this guy was bad for these reasons, I think it was a much larger attack on American history in general. I think it was their idea was not just that the Confederates are bad, but that basically there's not much of a distinction between Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. I mean, they're all just a part of America's ugly racist history, and that's that. And I think we saw, some incredible things that kind of got buried in the news. I mean, at the University of Wisconsin, there was an activist group that wanted to get rid of Abraham Lincoln statue, and one of the organizers actually said that, well, it's because Abraham Lincoln owned slaves, and it's, you get kind of these absurdities, but, this is sometimes the mentality for a lot of this movement. A lot of people see a statue and they say, well, that just represents America's horrible, past that's just awful, that needs to be destroyed. They don't care if it's a Confederate or a Unionist, if you save the Union or try to destroy it. It simply doesn't matter. You're part of America's horrible, ugly history that needs to be washed away for a brave new future. And to me, I could see that coming, watching this kind of play out, and I think that is unfortunate. And we can't really have a debate about history when there are some who simply want to erase it as soon as, it may even slightly offend them, even if they don't even understand the details of why it offends them.
We're talking with Jarrett Stepman. The book is The War on History. And, Jarrett, it also strikes me reading this that it wasn't that long ago that folks would try to co-opt historical figures instead of trashing them. It wasn't that long ago that President Obama would pull out a quote or two from President Reagan, who the left reviled when he was in office, to explain why his position was a sensible one. You talk about in the book how many states have now scrapped their Jefferson-Jackson dinners because they now revile both of those figures in American history, including the Democratic Party in the state of Louisiana, which Andrew Jackson is largely responsible for even being in the country.
That one really got to me because it was a combination of Jefferson, who, of course, in the Louisiana Purchase brought Louisiana into the country, and then, of course, Andrew Jackson, who became famous for winning the Battle of New Orleans, and I would say really saving the Southwest for conquest from the British. There's a lot of course, details about the Battle of New Orleans. I do think that ultimately if the British had won that battle, it would have stayed in British hands after the war, which would have certainly altered the course of American history. But, I think that's just kind of this mentality, this idea that, well, these people, didn't check off all the boxes, so let's get rid of them, even though our very existence depended on the actions and the ideas of these people. And to me, that's what's so rich in this whole debate. The very people that created our country or created the ideas and institutions that we hold most dear, we can't talk about them or celebrate them, that we ourselves are somehow superior or better because we live in the shadow of those decisions and those ideas, and we have benefited enormously from it, and we don't have to make the decisions they did. We don't have to fight on the shores of our own country to defend it from invaders. And to me, that's the kind of how rich this whole conversation is. And yes, again, you can go back and criticize those in our history. I think that's very fair. There are plenty of people in our history that I think made bad decisions that certainly didn't do right by their country. But is there to have those conversations or to understand them within the context of the other good things that they did, and to simply strip them and eliminate them whenever it becomes convenient or one person says that they're offended? That just ultimately leads to a kind of nihilism that doesn't help anybody.
So, Jarrett, as we conclude here, there's a lot to be concerned about, but how do you fight back when the public education system, maybe not with a totally broad brush, but a pretty broad brush, the media is certainly not going to help by and large. You've got an entire generation of young people who certainly seem to believe this, or a large percentage of them anyway. So how do you fight back effectively?
You know what? It is about going to those institutions that unfortunately have let this country down. I think the American elite used to push the ideas of Americanism and try to teach and pass those along. I think that's no longer the case. I think we're fortunate. There are a lot of common sense Americans in this country that understand this history, and they understand that they live in a great country. Many now, unfortunately, because of our education system, may be have lost some of the details. But that information is out there. You can counter these kind of narratives that those who want to detract from our history, you can counter them with facts. And frankly, especially in regard to education, I think pressure does need to be put on our public education system. I'm a big supporter of the idea of school choice and being able to tell your school districts, my child won't be learning anti-American propaganda, that I'm going to put my child in a different school, or I'm even going to homeschool my child and teach them, about American history and about civics that they've lost in a lot of our schools. I think it's about putting pressure on those institutions and not backing down and speaking up and having some courage. I mean, you have a great country that has given you so much. A lot of brave people did some incredible things to make sure that it was that way. I mean, I think Americans can draw a line in the sand, say, we're not going to let these people, these radicals, eliminate what's so good and we know to be good about our country, and fight back in the battle of ideas, in the battle of what this country is about. I think that is the battle line. It's more important than the debates in Congress. It's more important than a lot of the other big battles that we see on a daily basis. We have to save the ideas, our history, our culture, our civilization from these attacks.
Jarrett, we'll call time there. Congratulations again on the book, and thanks very much for a very important conversation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Jarrett Stepman, columnist for the Daily Signal, affiliated with the Heritage Foundation. The brand new book is The War on History, The Conspiracy to Rewrite America's Past. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.